"Sir, you need to come with us, now." The words cut clean through the low hum of rolling suitcases and distant boarding calls, sharp enough to make a few heads turn, but not enough to stop the airport from breathing. Marcus Reed didn't move right away. He stood just past gate C-17, one hand resting lightly on the worn strap of a canvas duffel, the other holding a folded boarding pass creased from being checked too many times. The overhead lights cast a pale, almost sterile glow across the polished floor, reflecting everything: shoes, shadows, hesitation. Around him, travelers slowed just enough to notice, then sped up again, like they'd learned not to linger where tension lived. The officer stepped closer, his voice firmer this time, practiced authority layered over something less precise. "I said now." Marcus turned his head slightly, not fast, not slow, just enough to meet the man's eyes. Calm, measured, the kind of calm that didn't come from comfort, but from control. His hoodie was plain gray, sleeves pushed just above the wrist, revealing nothing but skin and a faint line where a watch used to sit. No uniform, no rank, nothing that explained him. Just another black man in an airport that moved too quickly to ask questions and too slowly to forget what it thought it saw. A second officer approached from the side, positioning without touching, a silent choreography that boxed Marcus in without ever needing to say the word. Nearby, a woman paused mid-step, her coffee hovering inches from her lips, eyes flicking between the officers and Marcus like she was trying to decide which version of the moment was real. Someone else lifted a phone, not obvious, not hidden either, just enough to capture without committing. The air shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just tighter, like the space itself was holding its breath. "You fit the description," the first officer added, quieter now, as if that made it more reasonable. Marcus blinked once, slow, deliberate. His gaze drifted past the officers for a fraction of a second, catching the American flag hanging near the terminal ceiling, fabric barely moving in the recycled air. Then back to the man in front of him. "Do I?" he said, his voice even. Almost too even, the kind of tone that didn't rise to meet tension but let tension come to it. The officer didn't answer that. Instead, he gestured toward a corridor marked authorized personnel only, the fluorescent lights inside harsher, colder, like a place where stories got simplified. "Let's go." Marcus adjusted his grip on the duffel, not resisting, not complying too quickly either, just moving when movement became inevitable. As he stepped forward, the soft squeak of his sneakers echoed faintly against the tile, a small sound that somehow carried. People watched now, not openly, but enough. A man in a business suit slowed his stride, eyes narrowing. A teenage boy glanced up from his phone, curiosity flashing before being swallowed by habit. No one said anything. No one asked. The officers guided Marcus without touching him, yet close enough that space disappeared. At the threshold of the corridor, the noise of the terminal dimmed, replaced by a low mechanical hum and the distant buzz of overhead fixtures. The world behind him kept moving. Boarding groups, final calls, departures. But ahead, everything felt contained, controlled, decided. Marcus paused for half a second at the line where public space ended and something else began. Not hesitation, not fear, just a moment. His shoulders rose with a quiet breath, then settled. And then he stepped forward, leaving behind the noise, the eyes, the assumptions, carrying with him a silence that felt heavier than anything anyone had said. The corridor swallowed the noise the moment the door closed behind them, replacing the open chaos of the terminal with a narrow stretch of polished concrete and humming lights that flickered just enough to make everything feel slightly off balance. Marcus walked between the two officers without looking at either of them, his pace steady, shoulders relaxed, as if this was just another hallway, just another moment, even though the air carried a different weight here. The sign above the door reads security processing in bold black letters, clean and official, the kind of words that sounded neutral until you were the one being led inside. A camera in the corner tilted ever so slightly, tracking movement, silent and constant. The first officer pushed open another door, and a small room revealed itself, square, windowless, with a metal table bolted to the floor and two plastic chairs on opposite sides. No decoration, no warmth, just function. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing toward the chair facing the wall. Marcus set his duffel down carefully beside the table before sitting, his movements deliberate, unhurried, like each action had already been decided long before this moment. The second officer remained near the door, arms folded, watching. The first one circled around and placed a thin folder on the table, flipping it open with a practiced motion that suggested routine rather than curiosity. "Name," he said, not looking up right away. "Marcus Reed." Marcus answered, his voice calm, grounded, carrying no edge of defense, no attempt to explain more than what was asked. The officer nodded once, then glanced at a printed sheet inside the folder. "You traveling alone?" "Yes." "Purpose of travel?" "Returning home." The questions came measured, spaced out, like steps on a staircase you could not see the top of yet. Marcus answered each one the same way, evenly, without hesitation, without elaboration. The fluorescent light above them buzzed softly, casting a pale tone across his face, flattening shadows, making everything look a little more distant than it was. The officer finally looked up, studying Marcus now, not just processing him. "You were flagged," he said. "System picked up irregular movement tied to your boarding pass." Marcus tilted his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the statement without agreeing to it. "Irregular," he repeated, the word landing gently, as if testing its shape. The officer tapped the folder. "We get a lot of that these days. Better to check than to miss something." Behind him, the second officer shifted his weight, the faint creak of his duty belt breaking the quiet for a moment before it settled again. Marcus's eyes moved briefly to the table's surface, where faint scratches crossed the metal like old stories worn down over time. He ran his thumb once along the edge, feeling the texture, grounding himself in something physical, something real. "I understand," he said, and he meant it, at least in part. The officer leaned back slightly, folding his arms now, mirroring the posture of the man by the door. "You got any identification on you besides the boarding pass?" Marcus reached slowly into his back pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet, edges softened from years of use. He opened it carefully and slid a driver's license across the table. The officer picked it up, glanced at it, then looked back at Marcus again, longer this time. Something in his expression shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a thought forming but not yet spoken. "You ever been through this airport before?" he asked. "A few times," Marcus replied. "Never had an issue." The officer nodded, but it was not agreement, more like acknowledgement without conclusion. He placed the license down, fingers resting on it for a second longer than necessary. "Things change," he said. The room went quiet again, the kind of quiet that pressed in rather than settled, filling the space between words with something heavier. Marcus sat back slightly in his chair, hands resting loosely on his thighs, posture open, unthreatening, controlled. He did not argue. He did not ask why. He just waited. And in that waiting, something else became clear, something the room could not quite define but could not ignore either. Marcus was not reacting the way people usually did in rooms like this. No frustration. No raised voice. No urgency to prove anything. Just stillness. And sometimes, stillness unsettled people more than anything else. The officer closed the folder with a soft tap that echoed louder than it should have in the small room, then leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the metal table as if settling into something more deliberate now. His eyes stayed on Marcus, no longer scanning, no longer casual, but focused, measuring. "You keep saying you understand," he said, voice quieter, slower. "But most people in your position do not sit this still." The words were not aggressive, but they were not neutral either. They carried a kind of curiosity sharpened by doubt. Marcus did not respond immediately. He let the silence sit for a moment, not as resistance, but as space. The overhead light flickered once, then steadied again, casting the same pale glow across both men, flattening whatever difference might have existed between them. "Most people are trying to explain something," Marcus said finally, his tone even, controlled, "before they are asked." The officer's brow tightened slightly, just enough to show the shift. Behind him, the second officer adjusted his stance again, arms still crossed, but his gaze now more fixed, more attentive. The room felt smaller, as if the walls had edged in by an inch without anyone noticing. "So you are not concerned," the first officer continued, tapping a finger lightly against the closed folder, "about being pulled off your flight, held back here, and questioned?" Marcus's eyes moved briefly to the table again, tracing the same faint scratches, the same worn lines. Concern does not change what already happened, he replied. The officer exhaled slowly through his nose, leaning back in his chair now, studying Marcus in a different way, like he was trying to place something that did not quite fit. You military? He asked suddenly, the question landing in the space between them with more weight than the ones before it. Marcus's gaze lifted back to him, steady, unflinching. I served, he said, nothing more, nothing less. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, not in hostility, but in recognition of something incomplete. Served where? He pressed. A brief pause. Not hesitation, not uncertainty, just a choice. Overseas, Marcus answered. The second officer let out a quiet breath, almost a scoff but not fully formed, as if the answer confirmed something he already believed. The first officer did not react outwardly, but his fingers stopped tapping. You have any documentation for that? He asked. Marcus's hand rested loosely on his thigh, unmoving. Not with me. The room settled into another silence, thicker this time, less neutral. The officer leaned forward again, voice firmer now, the edge of authority returning. You understand that makes this more complicated. Marcus met his gaze without shifting. I understand how it looks, he said. The distinction was subtle, but it landed. The officer held his stare for a second longer than before, then reached for the driver's license again, turning it over as if it might reveal something new on the back. Marcus Reed. He repeated quietly, almost to himself. Then louder. You know, Mr. Reed, we are trained to notice patterns. Behavior, movement, inconsistencies. And right now, you do not fit a clear pattern. He set the license down again, aligning it carefully with the edge of the table. That makes people nervous. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, posture still relaxed, but his presence filling more of the room now, not physically, but in a way that was harder to define. Sometimes, he said, voice steady, the pattern is the assumption. The words did not rise. They did not push, but they stayed. The second officer shifted again, this time not just adjusting his stance, but uncrossing his arms, as if something in the air had changed direction. The first officer did not respond right away. He looked at Marcus, then at the folder, then back again, as if weighing something that had not been part of the process when this started. Outside the room, a distant announcement echoed faintly through the walls, a boarding call for a flight that would leave without one passenger. Inside, time felt slower, heavier, stretched between what was known and what had not yet been revealed. The officer finally straightened, drawing a slow breath, and spoke again, but the tone had shifted, less certain, more probing. We are going to need to take a closer look at your belongings, he said. Marcus nodded once, small, controlled. You can, he replied. But you are not going to find what you think you are looking for. The officer held his gaze, searching for something. Defiance, fear, anything, but found none. And in that absence, something else began to form, something quieter, more unsettling than any answer Marcus could have given. The zipper of the duffel bag sounded louder than it should have as the second officer pulled it open, the metal teeth separating with a slow, deliberate drag that seemed to stretch the moment longer than necessary. The room remained quiet except for that sound and the low hum of the overhead light. Marcus did not move. He sat back in the chair, hands resting loosely on his thighs, eyes steady, watching without interference, as if the contents of the bag were not a secret to protect, but something already decided. The officer reached inside, shifting items one by one with careful, almost exaggerated precision, like he expected something to reveal itself if he looked long enough. A neatly folded change of clothes, a pair of worn running shoes, a paperback book with its spine slightly bent from use. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. The officer paused, then dug deeper, his fingers brushing against something firmer. He pulled it out slowly. A small rectangular case, matte black, no markings on the outside. He turned it over once in his hand, then looked toward the first officer. What is this? He asked. The first officer stepped closer, his attention sharpening instantly. Open it, he said. The latch clicked softly as the case was unfastened. Inside, resting in a fitted interior, was a single object. Not large, not flashy, just a simple metallic pin, engraved with an insignia that caught the light in a way that made it stand out against the dark lining. The second officer frowned slightly, unfamiliar. The first officer leaned in, eyes narrowing as recognition flickered across his face, faint but undeniable. He did not speak right away. Instead, he reached out and lifted the pin carefully, holding it between his fingers as if its weight had suddenly changed. The room shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, but something in the air tightened, sharpened, like a line had been drawn that no one had noticed before. "Where did you get this?" the first officer asked, his voice lower now, less certain than it had been moments ago. Marcus's gaze did not leave him. "It was issued," he said. The officer studied the pin again, then looked back at Marcus, searching for confirmation, contradiction, anything that would anchor what he was seeing. "Issued by who?" he pressed. Marcus held the silence for a fraction of a second, not as defiance, but as control. "The Navy," he answered. The second officer let out a quiet breath, shifting his stance again, this time not out of impatience, but something closer to unease. The first officer placed the pin back into the case, but his movements had changed. Slower, more careful, as if he was no longer handling evidence, but something else entirely. He closed the case gently, setting it on the table instead of tossing it aside like the other items. His eyes stayed on Marcus now, the earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more measured. "You said you served overseas," he said, his tone no longer probing, but recalibrating. Marcus nodded once. The officer glanced at the folder, then back at the duffel, then at Marcus again, the pieces not quite fitting the way they had at the beginning. "You did not think it was important to mention this?" he asked. Marcus's expression did not change. "You did not ask the right question," he replied. The words landed quietly, but they stayed. The second officer looked between them, the dynamic in the room no longer clear, no longer one direction. The first officer exhaled slowly, running a hand across the back of his neck, a small gesture that betrayed the shift more than anything he had said. "All right," he muttered, almost to himself, before straightening again, trying to regain the structure of the situation. "We are going to verify this," he said, but the firmness in his voice was thinner now, stretched over uncertainty. Marcus leaned back slightly, posture unchanged, presence steady. "You can try," he said, his tone even, almost calm to the point of unsettling. "But verification does not always come from where you expect it." The room fell silent again, but it was not the same silence as before. This one carried weight, direction, the sense that something had already shifted and could not be undone. Outside, another distant announcement echoed faintly through the walls, a reminder that time was still moving somewhere else, even if inside this room, everything had begun to slow. The first officer glanced once more at the closed case on the table, then back at Marcus, and for the first time since this began, he was not entirely sure which side of the table held the authority. The officer stepped back from the table, creating a few feet of distance as if space itself might help restore control to a situation that had quietly slipped out of his hands. He reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pressed it. "I need a supervisor in processing room 3, he said, voice steady but carrying an undertone that had not been there before. "Now." The response came back as static and a brief acknowledgement, nothing more. The second officer glanced at him, then at Marcus, then back again, the uncertainty no longer hidden behind routine. Marcus remained seated, still, composed, his eyes resting not on either man but somewhere between them, as if he was observing the space itself rather than the people inside it. The black case sat on the table, closed now, but it seemed to hold more presence than any object should. The minutes that followed stretched longer than they should have, marked only by the hum of the lights and the faint echo of distant airport activity bleeding through the walls. The first officer paced once, slow, controlled, then stopped near the table again, his hand resting lightly on the edge as if grounding himself. "If what you are implying is accurate," he said, choosing each word carefully, "then there are procedures for that." Marcus did not look up immediately. When he did, his gaze was steady, unchanged. "There always are," he replied. The officer nodded, but it was not agreement. It was acknowledgement of something he could not fully define. The door opened, and a third presence entered the room. Supervisor Karen Mitchell, mid-40s, composed, her uniform crisp, her expression sharp but not unkind. She took in the scene in a single sweep, eyes moving from the officers to Marcus to the items on the table, then settling on the black case. "What do we have?" she asked, her voice calm, controlled, carrying authority without needing to raise volume. The first officer stepped forward, handing her the folder, speaking quickly but clearly. "Passenger flagged by the system. Behavior inconsistent. During inspection, we found this." He gestured toward the case. Mitchell opened it without hesitation. The moment her eyes landed on the insignia inside, something in her posture shifted. Not dramatically, not enough for someone untrained to notice. But it was there. A slight pause. A recalibration. She closed the case gently, then looked at Marcus directly for the first time. "Mr. Reed," she said, her tone measured, respectful but still professional. "Is there anything you would like to clarify at this point?" Marcus met her gaze, unflinching, calm. "You already have what you need," he said. Mitchell held his eyes for a second longer, then turned slightly toward the officers. "Step outside for a moment," she instructed, her voice quiet, but leaving no room for hesitation. The two officers exchanged a brief glance, then complied, the door closing behind them with a soft click that felt louder than before. The room changed instantly. Less crowded, more focused. Mitchell placed the case back on the table, aligning it carefully with the edge, mirroring the earlier gesture, but with more intention. "You understand the position this puts us in," she said, not accusatory, not defensive, simply stating a fact. Marcus nodded once. "I do." She studied him, not as a suspect now, but as something else, something more complex. "And you chose not to identify yourself earlier," she added. Marcus's expression remained steady. "I chose to answer what was asked," he said. Mitchell exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling across her shoulders in a way that did not show in her posture, but did in her eyes. "We are going to need confirmation," she said, softer now, more precise. Marcus's gaze shifted briefly to the case, then back to her. "That depends on who you ask," he replied. A faint silence followed, heavier than any before it. Mitchell understood the implication. Verification was no longer a simple process of checking records or making a standard call. This was something else, something higher, something that required a different kind of access. She straightened slightly, making a decision. "Do you have a point of contact?" she asked. Marcus held her gaze for a moment, then gave a small, controlled nod. "I do," he said. Mitchell stepped back, gesturing subtly toward the table. "Then make the call," she said. The room went still again, but this time it was not uncertainty that filled the space. It was anticipation. Marcus reached slowly for his phone, which had been placed just out of reach earlier, and drew it toward him. His movements were unhurried, precise, as if every second was exactly where it needed to be. He unlocked the screen, scrolled once, then stopped. His thumb hovered for just a moment before pressing a single contact. He lifted the phone to his ear, posture unchanged, expression steady. The line rang once, then twice. Then it connected. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not explain. He spoke only a few words, calm, clear, deliberate. "This is Reed. I need you to listen carefully." And just like that, the balance in the room shifted again, this time in a way that no one inside it could control anymore. The line stayed open, but Marcus did not speak again. He did not need to. The silence on his end was not empty. It was deliberate, controlled, the kind of silence that carried more meaning than any explanation could. On the other side of the call, a voice responded, low and immediate, stripped of casual tone, as if it recognized something in Marcus's first words that required no introduction. Marcus listened, eyes steady, posture unchanged, his gaze drifting briefly toward the faint reflection on the metal table where the overhead light created a dull, almost mirror-like surface. For a moment, he saw himself there, not clearly, not fully, just enough to recognize the outline of a man who had learned long ago how to sit still when everything around him moved too fast. "Yes," he said quietly into the phone. "That is correct." Supervisor Mitchell stood a few feet away, not interrupting, not stepping closer, but watching with a focus that had sharpened into something precise. Her hands rested lightly at her sides, fingers still, but her attention fully engaged, tracking every small shift in Marcus's tone, every pause between his words. The room felt different now, not tense in the same way as before, not uncertain, just suspended, like time had slowed enough for something important to unfold without interference. Marcus's breathing remained even, measured, the rise and fall of his chest subtle, controlled. He closed his eyes for a brief second, not out of fatigue, but as if aligning something internal, something that had nothing to do with the room or the people inside it. When he opened them again, his gaze was clearer, sharper, focused somewhere beyond the immediate space. "I understand," he said into the phone. Another pause. Then, softer, "No, I did not identify myself." His voice did not carry regret. It carried clarity, the kind that came from knowing exactly why a choice had been made. Mitchell shifted her weight slightly, the faint sound of her shoe against the floor breaking the stillness for a moment before it settled again. She glanced once at the closed door, where the two officers waited outside, then back at Marcus, her expression unreadable but attentive. Marcus lowered his voice just slightly, not enough to hide, but enough to signal that the conversation had moved into a different layer. "I am at Terminal C, security processing," he said. "Yes, with local officers." Another pause. The faintest flicker of something passed across his face, not emotion exactly, but recognition. "Understood," he added. The room seemed to tighten around that word, as if it carried weight beyond its simplicity. Outside, a distant announcement echoed again, muffled by walls, irrelevant to the moment unfolding inside. Marcus remained seated, still as before, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer passive. It was anchored, deliberate. Like a center point, everything else was beginning to move around. He lowered the phone slightly from his ear, listening, then gave a small nod, even though the person on the other end could not see it. "I will wait," he said. Then he ended the call. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. No hum, no shift, no movement. Just a moment suspended between what had been said and what would come next. Marcus placed the phone gently on the table, aligning it beside the closed case without looking, his movements precise, almost instinctive. He leaned back slightly in his chair, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward. Not at Mitchell, not at the door, just forward. Mitchell took a slow breath, stepping closer now, not with urgency, but with intention. "Who did you call?" she asked, her voice controlled, but quieter than before, as if volume no longer held authority here. Marcus turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze. "Someone who will answer," he said. The words were simple, but they settled into the room with weight. Mitchell held his eyes for a moment, then gave a small nod, more to herself than to him, as if acknowledging a shift she could not reverse. She stepped back again, creating space, not out of distance, but out of understanding. Outside the door, footsteps passed, faint, unaware. Inside, everything waited. Marcus did not move. He did not speak. He simply sat there, breathing evenly, grounded in a calm that did not come from the room, or the situation, or the people around him. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere earned. And for the first time since this began, the question was no longer whether he belonged in that chair. The question was how long the room itself could hold what was about to arrive. The knock did not come. There was no warning, no gradual approach, no build-up that matched the weight gathering inside the room. Instead, the door opened with a quiet, controlled motion, and a man stepped in wearing a dark suit that did not carry a badge, did not carry a name, but carried something else entirely. Authority that did not need to be announced. Supervisor Mitchell straightened immediately, instinctively, her posture sharpening in a way that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with recognition. The man's eyes moved across the room once, taking in Marcus, the table, the closed case, and then settling with quiet precision. "Is he still being detained?" he asked, his voice calm, level, but carrying a tone that did not invite interpretation. Mitchell hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then answered, "He is being held for verification." The man nodded once, then stepped further into the room, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to seal something in place. "Verification has already been completed," he said. No raised voice, no emphasis, just a statement, the kind that did not need reinforcement. The air shifted instantly, not gradually, not subtly, completely. Mitchell's gaze flicked toward Marcus for a brief moment, then back to the man. "May I ask your position?" she said, careful, controlled. The man reached into his jacket, producing a thin card, holding it just long enough for her to see, then lowering it again. Whatever was on that card did not need to be spoken. Mitchell's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. The calculation was gone, replaced by clarity. Understood, she said quietly. The man turned his attention to Marcus now, and for the first time since entering the room, there was a shift in tone. Not softer, not warmer, but different. Mr. Reed, he said, you should not have been stopped. Marcus met his gaze, steady, unchanged. It happens, he replied. The man held that for a second, then gave a small nod, not agreement, but acknowledgement of something deeper than the situation itself. Behind the door, movement could be heard, the faint shuffle of the two officers who had been waiting outside, unaware that the structure they had been standing on had just shifted beneath them. The man glanced toward the door. Bring them in, he said. Mitchell moved immediately, opening the door and gesturing for the officers to return. They stepped back into the room, their earlier confidence gone, replaced by uncertainty they had not yet named. Their eyes moved first to Mitchell, then to the man in the suit, then finally to Marcus. The first officer spoke, attempting to reclaim some part of the situation. We were following procedure, he said, his voice steady but thinner now. The man in the suit did not look at him right away. When he did, it was brief, precise. Procedure requires awareness, he said. Not assumption. The words were not loud, but they landed. The second officer shifted his weight, the sound of his movement louder than before in the tightened space. The first officer's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing further. The man turned back to Marcus. You are clear to go, he said. No hesitation. No condition. Just finality. Marcus did not move immediately. He glanced once at the black case on the table, then at his phone, then back up. My belongings, he said calmly. Mitchell stepped forward, gathering the items with care, placing them back into the duffel in the same order they had been removed, her movements precise, respectful now in a way they had not been earlier. She handed the bag to Marcus without a word. He took it, standing slowly, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, grounded. The man in the suit stepped aside slightly, creating space for him to pass, not as a gesture of submission, but of recognition. Marcus paused for just a moment, looking at the two officers, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something quieter, something that stayed longer. Next time, he said, his voice even, controlled, ask better questions. The words did not echo. They did not need to. He turned and walked toward the door, each step measured, unhurried, the same way he had walked in, but the room behind him was no longer the same. The officers remained where they stood, silent, the weight of what had just unfolded settling into them in a way that would not fade quickly. Mitchell watched Marcus reach the doorway, her expression composed, but her eyes carrying a recognition that had not been there before. The man in the suit said nothing more. He simply stood there, the presence he brought with him now fully understood. And as Marcus stepped out into the corridor, the hum of the airport returning slowly around him, the balance had already been rewritten, not by force, not by volume, but by something far more difficult to ignore. The corridor outside felt wider than before, but quieter in a way that made each step more noticeable. Marcus walked at the same steady pace, the duffel strap resting against his shoulder, his gaze forward, not searching, not reacting, just moving. The fluorescent lights stretched in a long line above him, each one casting a pale reflection on the polished floor, creating a path that looked almost endless. Behind him, the door to the processing room closed again, this time without urgency, without tension, just a quiet seal over what had already passed. Inside, the silence lingered. The two officers remained where they stood, the space around them heavier now, filled with something they could not dismiss as routine. The first officer exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just slightly, the weight of the moment settling into him in a way that was not visible but deeply felt. He looked at the table, at the empty space where the case had been, then at the door Marcus had just walked through. We did not know, he said, the words coming out, softer than he intended, more to himself than to anyone else. Supervisor Mitchell did not respond immediately. She stood still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze fixed on the same door. You did not ask, she said finally, her tone calm, not accusatory, but firm in a way that did not need to rise. The distinction landed. The second officer shifted, running a hand across the back of his neck, mirroring a gesture he had seen earlier but now carrying a different meaning. He did not tell us anything, he added, almost defensive, but the edge was weaker now, less certain. Mitchell turned slightly, her eyes settling on him with quiet precision. He answered every question you asked, she said. The room fell silent again, but this silence did not feel like uncertainty. It felt like recognition. Outside, Marcus reached the end of the corridor, the sound of the airport returning gradually, the low murmur of conversations, the rolling of luggage, the distant echo of boarding announcements filling the space ahead. He pushed through the door and stepped back into the terminal, where everything moved as if nothing had happened. People passed by him without looking, without knowing, without realizing how close they had been to something that could not be seen from the outside. Marcus adjusted the strap of his duffel slightly, the motion small, habitual. His eyes moved once across the terminal, taking in the gates, the crowds, the screens displaying departures and delays, all of it familiar, all of it unchanged. And yet, something had shifted. Not in the space, in the weight of it. Back in the room, the first officer finally sat down in the chair Marcus had occupied moments before, the metal surface cool beneath him, the scratches on the table now directly in front of his eyes. He traced one of the lines with his finger, the same way Marcus had earlier, but the meaning was different now. He could have said something. He murmured, quieter now, less certain, as if the words themselves did not fully hold. Mitchell watched him for a moment, then shook her head slightly. He should not have needed to, she replied. The man in the suit remained near the door, silent, his presence unchanged, but no longer central. The shift had already happened. The lesson had already been delivered. He glanced once at Mitchell, then at the officers, before turning toward the door himself. Make sure your reports reflect accuracy, he said, his voice calm, final. Not assumption. Then he stepped out, leaving the room with less noise than when he entered. The door closed behind him, and for a moment, no one moved. Outside, Marcus continued walking, blending back into the flow of travelers, his presence no longer marked, no longer contained. A young child standing near a gate looked up briefly as he passed, eyes curious but unafraid. Marcus met the child's gaze for just a second, then gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before continuing on. No words, no explanation, just a quiet acknowledgement. The terminal lights reflected softly off the floor beneath his feet as he moved forward, steady, unhurried, leaving behind a room that would not forget him, and stepping into a world that never realized it almost did. Marcus slowed as he approached the gate, the steady rhythm of footsteps and distant voices settling into something almost familiar again, like a world that had never paused, never noticed the shift that had just taken place behind a closed door. The departure screen flickered above, rows of cities and times glowing in soft blue light, each one marking a destination, a direction, a continuation. He glanced up once, confirming what he already knew, then moved toward an empty seat near the window where the late afternoon light stretched across the floor in long, quiet lines. He set his duffel down beside him, the fabric brushing lightly against the polished surface, and leaned back, exhaling slowly, not out of relief, but out of release, like something had finally settled back into place. Outside the glass, planes moved in the distance, slow and deliberate, guided along invisible paths that only a few understood. Marcus watched one taxi across the runway, its motion steady, unhurried, precise. For a moment, everything felt aligned. Not easy, not resolved, just clear. Around him, passengers gathered in small clusters, conversations rising and falling in soft waves, laughter here, frustration there, the ordinary rhythm of people moving through places that did not remember them once they were gone. A man in a business suit scrolled through his phone. A couple argued quietly over seating. A child sat cross-legged on the floor, tracing shapes on a tablet screen with quiet concentration. Life continued. It always did. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the small black case, turning it over once in his hand before opening it. The metallic insignia caught the light again, reflecting a sharp, clean line across its surface. He looked at it for a moment, not with pride, not with regret, just recognition. Then he closed the case and slipped it back into his bag, out of sight, where it had always been. A final boarding call echoed through the terminal, clear and steady. inviting passengers to move forward, to step into whatever came next. Marcus stood, lifting the duffel over his shoulder with the same controlled motion as before, his posture unchanged, his presence quiet but grounded. As he stepped into the boarding line, no one looked twice. No one paused. To them, he was just another traveler moving from one place to another. But the weight he carried was not visible. It never had been. At the entrance to the jet bridge, he paused for just a fraction of a second, his eyes drifting once more across the terminal behind him, not searching, not lingering, just acknowledging. The lights, the movement, the noise, all of it continued without interruption. And yet, somewhere within it, something had been corrected. Not loudly, not publicly, but undeniably. Marcus stepped forward, handing his boarding pass to the agent, who scanned it without hesitation, without question, the soft beep signaling approval. He walked down the narrow bridge, the sound of his footsteps muted now, absorbed by the enclosed space, each step carrying him further from what had happened and closer to what waited ahead. Inside the aircraft, the cabin lights glowed warm, a contrast to the cold brightness of the terminal, and as he found his seat and settled in, the world outside the window began to blur into motion again. Engines hummed, the plane shifted, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to move. Marcus rested his head back, eyes open, steady calm. No announcement marked what had changed. No voice explained it. But in the quiet space between what was seen and what was understood, something remained. Not anger, not victory, just a quiet, undeniable truth that did not need to be spoken to be felt. And as the plane lifted, leaving the ground behind in a smooth, steady rise, the world below continued as it always had, unaware that, for a brief moment, it had been asked to look closer, to question faster judgments, and to recognize something it almost overlooked.